I'd like to say thank you very much to you all for the invite today, and just been following some of the chat on Twitter this morning. It certainly got off to a good start and some real searching questions there. So I'm hoping in the next 10 to 15 minutes that I add to the conversation. I'm conscious that I'm going to perhaps raise some of the thorny issues that perhaps we talk about over coffee, but not necessarily in a formal setting. So work with me, hold my hand collectively, because we're going to see how this goes. I do actually have a PowerPoint, which I hope Kevin and the team will be able to distribute to you after this morning, and I'm happy to take some questions at the end. But I think first and foremost, we're going to kick off just thinking about policy convention, a right to youth work in Scotland. For me, that question is a right to youth work, a right to youth workers. And what I'm going to talk about is actually where youth work sits in the bigger kind of cycle of education, of community learning and development. We'll go through some of the rights, the theory and the practice, but very quickly, don't worry, I won't take too long there. And think about some of our shared values in terms of the UNCRC and the shared rights. So the things that are in there where there's common ground. And then I really want to explore the right to CLD youth workers. And what are the real challenges there? Or what are the kind of thorny issues or the wicked issues that we bump up against time and time again? And then I want us to kind of consider, how do we grow the learning culture and find the space for collective action, professional action? And then I'll take some questions and some comments. So essentially, I think when you think about it, in Scotland, we've got a really unique education system, and that community learning and development and youth work is absolutely part of it. So if you think about the life stage from the cradle to the grave, you will find all but education, community learning and development cuts all of that. And whilst often in youth work, you think that you're perhaps working with a specific age group, when you actually look in the broader sense, you're also working with parents, with older brothers and sisters, aunts, uncles, and you're generally working in the community. Our space for professional action is always the social context in which the young people that we work with occupy. It's not a statutory that they have to do, and that's really, really important, because there's lots of other spaces in young people's lives where they have to do, and the most important thing you can ever give anyone is your time. And I think the fact that the young people give us their time when they walk into our youth services, whatever guise that may be in, they're given as the biggest compliment of all. And our professional purpose is about that transformation, working with young people, but also sometimes it's about protective. It's about sometimes helping young people or working with young people to ascertain their rights and to promote what their rights are. And at the heart of this, it's always about people. Fundamentally, our work in community learning and development youth work is always about people. And when you think about the very first article of the UNCRC, when you look at it, Article 1 states quite clearly that every child has got the right to every convention. So whilst we can cherry pick what parts that we think work better for CLD youth work, actually when you look at it, all young people that we work with have got access to absolutely every part of it. And when you think about CLD youth work, you're thinking about services, because it's a noun in one respect, whether that's in the local, the voluntary sector, the local authority sector, in private kind of spaces, whatever that looks like. We all know about holiday programmes, drop-in, peer education projects, outdoor learning, all of the different uniform organisations, you know. It is actually a noun, it is a thing. But actually, if you think about CLD youth work, it's something that we do. It is a practice, it is an actual action, because our field of professional practice enables people to identify their collective goals, either individually or as that group, and to think about taking positive change, transformative change. Our practice is always dialogical. It's always about having that action research pedagogy where we plan, do, review, revise. And we very much, the whole heart of CLD youth work is about working with those young people in those communities that are most excluded. And hence the reason young people, by the very virtue of their age, definitely need that extra work, support, and so on. And when you think about the actual values that underpin CLD youth work services, and you look at the UNCRC, there's quite a lot of things that there's common ground there. So if you think about, for instance, self-determination, as we talked about earlier, where young people absolutely have that right to access services. If you look at Article 15, the freedom of association, that choice where people are allowed to get together, to converse, to think about what the issues are that they need to address and what things are actually working for them. If you think about inclusion as one of the kind of key values that underpin CLD youth work practice, if you look from Article 2, 22, 23, 30, absolutely everything in those different articles are all about non-discrimination and inclusion. If you think about collaboration, Article 5, that's very much what we do in terms of working with young people, for young people, and that dialogical. And if you think about very specifically in the UNCRC, what it does say is that we need to think about the young people's increasing capacities to make their own choices and to make sure that they're part of that journey. One of our other values is about lifelong learning. And if you think about that whole youth work process, from when young people walk in the door at whatever stage, to sometimes when they leave, or indeed they don't leave because they go on and become youth workers or volunteers. And if you look at Articles 17, 28 and 29, it's always about lifelong learning. And most importantly, I suppose, Article 29, thinking about the goals of education, about where we must develop every child's personality, talents and abilities to fulfil. So if that doesn't actually hit what our CLD youth work agenda is, I don't know what does. And most importantly, it's that bit about empowerment. You know, one of our fundamental values as CLD youth workers. And if you look at Article 12 and Article 13, that will help to kind of see where that respect for the views of the child and freedom of expression is really, really important. And I'm hoping that we will be able to send that on so you can kind of see where we can draw the correlations. So as I said, that might be, when you look at UNCRC, and it offers us to find that space for the right to youth work. Unfortunately, it doesn't give us the right to youth workers. And one of the biggest challenges, I guess, that we face is that there's actually no mandatory requirements for employers. And this is where I'm going to get into perhaps some of the more thorny issues. So often what you find if you're going for jobs, you'll see jobs that you think, wait a minute, that should be a youth work job, that should be a youth worker post, but it's not. It's perhaps put out elsewhere. And that can sometimes restrict your opportunities for movement within the employment market. And also about the visibility of us as a sector. Sometimes that bit about competition versus collaboration, you know, can sometimes be really, really challenging. And you'll hear that in terms of the variance of employment terms and conditions. I'm really delighted to see that the STUC are online with us today, because some of the recent data, if you look at Youth Borders, Susan Hunter's team, just done a fabulous piece of work. But what was quite frightening was looking at the different employment terms and conditions that what we see that youth workers are experiencing. And it really echoes some of the findings that CLD Standards Council found in 2018. And sad to say that it doesn't look as though it's improving early. So when you think about things like hourly rates, job titles, the number of hours people are employed for, the types of contracts, temporary, fixed term appointments, not having that longer term to get in there. There's always that debate, if you hear that, you know, about qualifications. You know, I don't need a qualification, that's not for me. If we want to think about you know, that competence and standards, sometimes we get really het up and I need the qualification. We do need the competence and we do need the standards, because our young people do expect, rightly so, to have the best service providers and people, volunteers working with them. So it's about making sure that infrastructure's there, but sometimes we get stuck in that real kind of challenge between it. Some of the funding and governance issues there. So if you look, that's where the competition sometimes kicks in. So rather than looking at what a particular piece of funding is that might work for us across the sector, we're having to bid in to keep our own organisations alive. We're having to change our job titles because perhaps that CLD youth worker job title isn't perhaps the most sexiest in terms of what national policy is. And if you think about that policy landscape in terms of youth work, sometimes it can be quite challenging for practitioners because you're thinking about it in a micro level. What is it that your employer or your organisation or your agency that you need to do and work with? What is it in the kind of mid-level, so round about your local partnerships? What is it that you need to happen? And also what's going on nationally, all can confuse, but also offer opportunities right across the sector and the workforce. There is often that debate about volunteers versus paid staff, and I don't think that really should be something that it's about everybody. We absolutely need the volunteers. We need that. They're the lifeblood of what goes on in CLD youth work across Scotland. But unfortunately, you do hear some of those conversations. And how do we move on from that culture and be more inclusive as a particular area of practice? If you think about, as I said earlier, about our professional identity, our job titles are often changed. You know, I think I once had a job as an area coordinator. I was actually a youth worker for 30 years, you know, but what does that tell anybody about what I did? You know, I actually worked with young people. So that can be really challenging in terms of us trying to find that space, that visibility of this is who we actually are. Career progression routes can be really quite challenging too. Often people, when they come into the profession at various entry points, don't necessarily see where it is that they want to go. Sometimes that's about moving within local authority structure, a voluntary structure, the NHS. The employment opportunities for CLD youth work practitioners are vast, but it's how do we make that visible? How does that tie up to the qualification framework that's in place too? There's some real recruitment challenges, and again, that links back to some of the terms and conditions. I noticed last week on one of the youth work forums where there was a fora, should I say, there was a call out looking for some youth workers, but then it said, actually, this is an unpaid position, but you might quite like it. But actually, when you looked at what young people, what you were asking people to do was really quite challenging. And I was thinking, that might be something where people should actually be getting paid for what they're doing there. There's often challenges around about the ethics of it all. Always the young people are the primary client, and you're challenging those kind of demands from you as a professional practitioner, as an employee, as a volunteer. And particularly people struggle with that sometimes when they go into frontline management or first line management, feeling that perhaps they're moving away from what that ask of what the young people, because if you remember that kind of bottom up, it can sometimes be quite challenging having to manage that kind of ethical space. One of the kind of biggest challenges for us right across the workforce is about that equity and diversity. We're predominantly female led. And again, Youth Borders found that, we found that doesn't seem to be changing. The demographics of the employment across the youth work sector, we tend to be ageing unless you're in a kind of part-time contract. So there seems to be something about the different types of contracts that people are on that seems to be affecting where we're at. And there's also the huge issue about capacity and resources. I think it's quite interesting when you look at so much of the work that's going on across the education reform at the moment. I often find myself thinking, well, actually, if you really properly invested in CLD youth work services, that would really help us crack open some of the things that we've got in place across Scotland. So I think there's some of the challenges, but I also think we have a lot of opportunities. And I think, again, it was quite interesting when I was looking at just following some of the chat earlier, where people were saying, what do we mean by statutory? Do you know? And I guess that's one of the things for us as youth workers, when you think about CLD is actually embedded in law in Scotland. If you look at the statutory guidance, you have every local authority in Scotland has to submit a plan for 3 years that includes youth work. And that's not just about what the local authority are going to do, it's very much about what the community planning partnership are going to do, what about the volunteers, and how we're going to meet the needs in those particular areas. Again, some of the challenges in there is about making where the workforce is visible, what the opportunities are, what the resources are, what the capacity is. And also, if you think about the actual Education Scotland Act 1980, if you look right into that, there's spaces where we can argue quite strongly for CLD youth work provision to be provided. So we do have a kind of a legislative background there that I suppose there's an opportunity to nudge that in terms of employers thinking about how do we actually really make sure that we're looking for youth workers per se. If you think about we are recognised as a professional practice. We do have the CLD Standards Council. We are all youth workers, voluntary, right through. We've got a broad church of membership, and it's absolutely got that well-developed system for approval, for registration, for professional learning, underpinned by the code of ethics, competencies and values. So we really do have that framework that you think about the different policies. So the National Youth Work Policy, the National Adult Learning Policy, all of that hang from the actual CLD youth work competencies and values. So we do have that space, and as I say, recognised across Scotland, not just by the Scottish Government, but again, we do know that often employers will ask for membership of the CLD Standards Council. One of the other things that's unique to the Scottish system, and particularly the Youth Work Scottish system, is that we are inspected by Her Majesty's inspectors. And I can't see you all, but I can feel that there'll be a collective rolling of eyes. And this is because it can be really quite challenging when you're being inspected and people are asking you, how good is our community learning and development? Tell us about the impact of your youth work. However, what that does do, and if you speak to colleagues across the United Kingdom where they don't have that Ofsted inspection or that HMI inspection, is that it really makes some of these real challenges even much more difficult, particularly when it comes to things like funding and visibility of the youth workforce. I mean, I think we've cracked the argument that we need youth work, but what we need to really push is that we need youth workers and we need them to be supported and sustained. We do actually have funding across Scotland. The challenge is that it's all in different bits, and it's really difficult to pull the data together to see actually where do we get this, how much is available, what can we use it for. And that's often where your professional practice as youth workers come to the fore, where you do spend quite a lot of work looking in between the policies and the different funding things, trying to find stuff that fits what your young people in your local community needs. We do have an international standing. We're recognised not just across the United Kingdom. We do work with the NYA, Wales, Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, but we're recognised right across Europe. And so many of my colleagues laugh at me when I say, we're the only country in the world that's got a professional association for community learning and development that gives us that real opportunity to connect right through your space, your career space. So whether you want to work in youth work, adult learning, community development, and that underpinning space. So we do have that international standing. And that's confirmed by the research, because if you look at the OECD reports, not just the most recent one that has recommended the reform of education, but actually the one in 2015, every time the OECD come to Scotland, they do recognise that CLD, youth work is particularly the jewel in the crown of the education services. So how do we think about growing that learning culture? Because some of this is about you yourself as a practitioner. Where do you want to go? What do you need in your job? How can your employer support you? What do you need to practice? What do your young people need for you to be able to practice? What does your community need for you to be able to practice? That real connection, events like this today are so important in terms of peer involvement, that kind of community of interest, the mentoring, the professional inquiry, thinking about what works, and also that network. And I think one of the things that we're really proud of in the CLD Standards Council over the last year has been able to introduce that buddying and mentoring programme, where people who have perhaps just joined the profession or people who are moving into a new job, whatever scale that is, have been able to buddy up with somebody else similar and be able to have some of those conversations, some of that challenge and support, coaching and mentorship. Again, for employers, the challenge there is round about job titles, terms and conditions, competencies, pathways, making sure that they're working in partnerships, articulation, not just for young people and learners through and across the learning systems, but also for us as a body of practitioners, and thinking about where the procedures and the collaboration are up to speed, and who can ever forget about technology and the real use. And I think that's been interesting over the last year, how much the CLD youth work sector were able to adapt and hit the ground running in terms of what that digital ask became, because I mean, there's often that assumption that young people just automatically know how to use technology, but there's various levels of access to kit, confidence, and all of the things that go in there. So again, huge big shout out. So finding that space for action and taking it forward, building on the evidence. We know that CLD youth work works, it is there, but I guess for me, it's about holding the line. Often what happens is we end up going to other people's agendas, so it becomes then about, health or well-being or something else, all of which is really important, but it's back to that fundamental bit. What are we? We're youth workers. It's about education, it's about transformation, and it's about protection. The health, the well-being, and everything else stems from that, but our fundamental area of practice is education and educators. If we also look at the policy space, and really kind of using that space for action, and how do we then take that forward, and as I said, not just at the national level, but at the micro levels, at the meso levels, and kind of trying to get a bit more collaboration in terms of terms and conditions and what that actually looks like, and just to kind of address some of the thorny issues. Perhaps looking at some of the audit and the governance that is round about there, so where is the spend, and not even just about money, but the other resources, where about time, because you think the time it takes to prepare for different learning sessions, programs, and building in that real bit about reflection, because as practitioners, that's really important, having that time with your team. Or on your own to kind of think about what worked, what didn't work, working with your young people. And really continue, I think, to build on our shared professional successes and challenge. I guess across Scotland, we do have, whilst we do have a really good network, people do speak to each other, and it's about continuing to build on that. So I guess I would just like to finish up this morning to saying the right to youth work is the right to CLD youth workers.